Executive Arab rejects rich women and falls for a poor African food delivery girl. He had it all. Mansions in Dubai, luxury yachts docked in Monaco, and women from the wealthiest families around the world fighting for a place in his life. But none of them ever moved him. None of them made his heart beat faster. That is, until a knock on his office door changed everything. She wasn't dressed in silk or diamonds. She wasn't even allowed past the lobby at first. She wore a faded hoodie, her hair tucked under a cheap cap, and in her hands, a plastic bag holding his lunch. She wasn't supposed to matter. But the way she looked at him, honest, raw, unafraid, pierced right through the world he had built to keep people out. What happened next is not just a love story. It's a story about defying expectations, breaking through class barriers, and discovering a kind of beauty money can't buy. And what this African woman did, without even realizing it, will leave you speechless. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. Real emotion, real connection, and the kind of moments that stay with you forever. Zaid al-Mansour sat behind the glass desk of his corner office, a panoramic view of the city of Abu Dhabi stretching endlessly behind him. The skyscrapers below shimmered in the midday sun, but his gaze was fixed on the untouched espresso in front of him. Another lunch meeting cancelled. Another woman trying to impress him with her father's bank account and her mother's pearls. He sighed. Zaid was 36, already the CEO of one of the largest logistics companies in the Middle East. And yet, he felt empty. Like everyone wanted something from him, but no one truly saw him. His assistants had lined up lunch dates with women from elite families for months, but he always walked away colder than he arrived. He was about to call it a day early when the knock came. Not the usual polite tap of his assistant. This one was hesitant, uncertain. Then another knock, firmer. He frowned, rising slowly. His office was on the 42nd floor. No one came here without clearance. When he opened the door, the sight in front of him wasn't just unexpected. It was disarming. A young woman, probably in her mid-20s, stood there holding a brown paper bag. She was dressed in worn jeans and a green jacket that looked 2 sizes too big. Her black hair was tied back in a messy braid, with a few strands stuck to her forehead from the heat outside. Her skin glistened with sweat, and in her eyes, big, deep, and full of life, was a mixture of panic and determination. I have a delivery for Mr. Al-Mansour, she said, breathless. He blinked. You brought it yourself? She nodded. There was a mix-up. The driver left it at the wrong building. I found it and I ran here. You ran? In this heat? She hesitated, then smiled slightly. It's your lunch. I figured a man like you doesn't wait. That smile. It wasn't seductive or rehearsed. It was real, vulnerable. The kind of smile that came from someone who'd been through hard days and kept going anyway. "Come in," he said before he could stop himself. She froze. "Sorry, I wasn't supposed to." "I said, come in." The office swallowed her in silence as she stepped inside cautiously, eyes scanning the floor-to-ceiling windows, the priceless artwork, the polished marble floors. She looked so out of place, and yet for the first time in months, the room felt alive. Zaid took the bag from her and placed it on the desk. "What's your name?" She hesitated again. "Aminata." "Aminata," he repeated, liking the weight of it. "You're not from here." "No, I'm from Senegal. Been here a year, delivering food, saving up." He raised an eyebrow. "Saving up for what?" She met his gaze, not with fear, but with pride. "To bring my mother here. She's sick, and to study, someday." There was a pause. Zaid, used to people groveling or flattering him, found himself leaning in, genuinely curious. She had no idea who he really was. And that, somehow, made this moment even more intimate. "You have determination," he said quietly. "I don't have much of a choice," she replied with a shrug. "When life closes doors, you find windows." He smiled for the first time that day. A buzz came through the intercom. His assistant, Layla, sounded annoyed. "Sir, your lunch date is waiting in the lobby. Should I send her up?" Zaid looked at the clock. He had completely forgotten. He pressed the intercom button. "Cancel it." There was a pause on the other end. "But, sir—" "Cancel it." He turned back to Aminata, who was already backing away, thinking she had overstayed. "I should go," she said quickly. "I really didn't mean to—" "Wait," he said, his voice low. She paused, one hand on the door. "You forgot your tip," he said softly. She turned around puzzled, and then he did something he had never done before. He walked toward her, pulled a sleek black card from his wallet, and placed it gently into her palm. "Use it," he said, "whatever you need." Her eyes widened. I can't accept this." "Yes, you can," he said, his voice firm but kind. "And you will." Their eyes locked. For a moment, neither moved. In that instant, something unspoken passed between them. A ripple in two very different worlds about to collide. Then she whispered, "Why are you doing this?" Zaid looked at her for a long time, and just as she opened the door to leave, he replied, "Because you're the first person in years who didn't ask me for anything." Aminata couldn't stop looking at the black card in her hand as she walked down the hall. Her fingers trembled around it, as if it might vanish the moment she looked away. She didn't even realize she'd stepped into the elevator until the doors closed behind her and her reflection stared back. A girl in worn sneakers holding a card that could probably buy everything she owned 100 times over. The moment the elevator doors opened at the ground floor, she felt like she had stepped back into reality. The heat hit her like a wall, and the buzzing of traffic and construction outside reminded her that she was just a delivery girl again. She slipped the card into her back pocket and hurried to her small electric scooter parked near the curb. She didn't look back. But he did. Zaid stood at his office window, eyes following her until she disappeared into the chaos of the city. Something about her had shaken him, not in a loud or dramatic way. It was quiet, like the gentle shattering of a glass you didn't know was already cracked. For the first time in years, he didn't feel trapped. The next day, he found himself hesitating before his usual lunch meeting. It was supposed to be with another heiress, this time from a Saudi banking family. Layla, his assistant, walked in with a stack of files. "She's downstairs, sir. Shall I have the chef prepare something special?" Zaid didn't look up. He was staring at a sticky note Aminata had scribbled on the delivery bag yesterday. It had said, "Careful, the sauce leaks from the side." "No," he said firmly. "Cancel it." Layla blinked. "Again?" "Send flowers. Apologize." Layla opened her mouth, then closed it. She knew better than to question him when he spoke like that. That evening, Zaid did something he had never done before. He opened the delivery app on his phone and searched for the restaurant Aminata worked at. It took him a while, but he remembered the logo on the bag. He placed an order. Nothing special, just a small couscous bowl and mint tea. And under delivery instructions, he wrote, "If possible, please send the same girl from yesterday. Name, Aminata." He stared at the screen for a long time before hitting confirm. 3 hours later, just as he was beginning to think she wouldn't come, the doorbell rang. Zaid opened the door himself. Aminata stood there, slightly out of breath, her helmet in one hand and the bag in the other. "You again," she said, raising an eyebrow. He chuckled. "You remembered me." "It's hard to forget someone who gives you a card that could probably pay off my landlord's house." She handed him the bag and crossed her arms. "I didn't use it." "I know," he said, stepping aside. "You would have gotten a call from my bank if you had." She tilted her head. "So, why did you ask for me?" Zaid hesitated. He could have said it was a coincidence, that it was about the food, that he had business to discuss. But none of that would have been true. "I wanted to talk to you," he said simply. "Me?" "You." She gave a dry laugh. "What could a man like you possibly want from a delivery girl?" Zaid looked at her, really looked at her. "Honesty. Someone who doesn't see my money first, or at all." Aminata's face softened. There was a long pause, filled only by the quiet hum of the city far below. "Can I ask you something?" she said cautiously. "Of course." "Are you lonely?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped back, opened the door wider, and said something she never expected to hear. "Come in." She froze. "I'm not dressed for—" I don't care what you're wearing. I care that you're real. Still hesitant, Aminata stepped inside. His apartment was breathtaking. Marble floors, glass walls, a view that could make you forget your own name. But it wasn't the wealth that caught her attention. It was the emptiness. No photos, no laughter, no warmth. You live here alone? She asked. Zaid nodded. Always have. They sat on the couch, her bag still clutched in her hands, as if she might have to run. And then, out of nowhere, he asked, "What do you dream of?" She blinked. What? If money wasn't a problem, if you could be anywhere, doing anything, what would it be? Aminata looked down, then up at him, and smiled softly. I'd open a small cafe, somewhere with music and books, and I'd bring my mother to sit there every day. That's my dream. Zaid said nothing, but in his eyes something shifted, and Aminata could feel it. She had just entered a world she never thought she'd belong to, and unknowingly left the door wide open behind her. Zaid couldn't stop thinking about her. He was used to controlling everything in his life. Meetings scheduled down to the second, meals curated by nutritionists, even his personal relationships filtered through advisors and contracts. But Aminata didn't fit into that world. She didn't ask for an invitation, and yet somehow she had walked straight into the center of it and into his thoughts without even realizing. He tried to shake it off. He told himself it was just curiosity, a passing fascination with someone so different, so grounded. But the truth ran deeper. For the first time, someone had spoken to him like a human being, not a walking fortune. And now, he was craving that feeling, like a man who hadn't tasted water in years. 3 days passed without contact. He didn't want to overwhelm her. But on the 4th, he called the same restaurant again and placed another order. But this time, he didn't request her. He wanted to see what fate would do. At exactly 7:13 p.m., there was a knock on the door. His heart beat a little faster. He opened it slowly. It wasn't her. A young man stood in the hallway, chewing gum and looking bored. Order for Mr. Al-Mansour? Zaid nodded and took the bag without a word. As the elevator closed, he stood in silence, staring at the door, feeling something unfamiliar, disappointment. He didn't eat the food. That night, he did something else he never did. He drove himself. No chauffeur, no security. He pulled up in an ordinary black SUV, windows tinted, and parked across the street from the delivery hub downtown. It was noisy, chaotic, filled with scooters, bikes, and voices yelling in 5 different languages. And then he saw her. Aminata was laughing with 2 other delivery riders, her helmet tucked under her arm. She looked happy, free. The sight made something ache in him, a longing he couldn't explain. He stepped out of the car, keeping his distance, watching her from the shadows. But before he could call her name, a tall man with a thick beard walked up behind her. He handed her a bottle of water and touched her arm. She smiled, not the way she smiled at Zaid, but still a smile. Jealousy hit him like a punch to the chest, and he hated himself for it. He turned and got back into his car. The next day, he did nothing, said nothing. But by the following afternoon, he gave in and sent her a message, not through the app, but through a private number. "If you're free tonight, I'd like to show you something. No pressure. Z." Aminata didn't reply right away. In fact, hours passed. He almost thought she had blocked him. But just after 8 p.m., the screen lit up. "Only if it doesn't involve fancy dinners. I just finished a 10-hour shift, and I'm still in my uniform." He smiled. "Perfect. I'll pick you up in 30 minutes. Just bring your eyes." When he arrived at the pickup spot, she was already waiting. Her helmet was on, and her backpack still had the restaurant's logo on it. "You really don't take days off," he said, opening the passenger door. She grinned. "Some of us don't live in penthouses." He laughed. "Touché." They drove in silence for a while. She kept glancing at him, trying to figure out what this was. A game, a pity act, or something real. Eventually, they pulled up to the edge of the desert just outside the city. The skyline faded behind them, and ahead, only dunes and stars. Zaid stepped out, walked around the car, and opened her door. "I wanted to show you this," he said. The night air was cool. The stars above sparkled like shattered diamonds across velvet. The silence was complete. No cars, no voices, just wind and space. Aminata looked around. "It's beautiful." "No cameras, no reporters, no pressure," he said, walking up beside her. "Just you and me and the truth." She glanced at him, her voice soft. "And what truth is that?" He looked at her, his expression serious now. "That I haven't felt like myself in years. And I don't know why, but when I'm around you, I do." The silence that followed was heavy, not uncomfortable, but loaded with meaning. She turned to him. "You barely know me, Zaid." "I know enough," he said. "You fight for what you love. You don't pretend. And you don't care who I am." Aminata looked down at the sand beneath her feet, then back up at him. "You say that now, but what happens when your world starts pushing back?" Zaid frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then said quietly, "Men like you don't stay with women like me. Your world doesn't let it happen." And before he could respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it. Her face changed. "I have to go." "What is it?" She looked up, eyes suddenly clouded. "It's my landlord. Something's wrong. I have to go. Zaid watched her walk back to the car, something inside him tightening. The magic of the night shattered just as quickly as it had begun. Zaid barely slept that night. He kept replaying Aminata's words over and over again. Your world doesn't let it happen. There was something in her voice that haunted him. Not fear, but certainty. Like she had already accepted a future where he walked away. Like she was used to being abandoned. By morning, his mood had darkened. He cancelled all his meetings and sent his driver away. For the first time, he didn't feel in control of his empire. And it terrified him. Still, he couldn't sit still. He needed to know she was okay. He drove himself across the city to the worn-down building she called home, a crumbling beige complex on the outskirts, far from the glimmering towers of downtown Abu Dhabi. He parked in a discreet spot and walked toward the front entrance, ignoring the stares from neighbors hanging laundry and children playing barefoot in the dust. He found her on the third floor, standing in the open hallway, arguing with a short, balding man who looked like he hadn't smiled in years. I told you, I just need one more week, she was pleading. My payment's coming on Monday. I've never missed before. The man rolled his eyes. Rules are rules. If you're late again, I'll have no choice. Zaid stepped forward before he could stop himself. Choice for what? He asked, voice calm but heavy. Aminata turned sharply, eyes wide. Zaid, what are you doing here? The landlord's eyes narrowed. Who's this? Zaid didn't answer. He pulled out his phone and, in front of both of them, made a call to his personal banker. I need a transfer to this address. How much is owed? He asked, glancing at the landlord. The man stuttered. 6 months, plus late fees, 21,000 dirhams. Zaid nodded. Make it 50,000. Advance for the year. And ensure the lease is transferred to her name. Aminata's voice rose, panicked. Zaid, no, don't do this. But it was already done. He hung up the phone and looked at her. You won't beg for space again, not while I'm around. She stared at him, anger and disbelief fighting for control. You think this is kindness, but it's not. You're taking away my fight. No, he said gently. I'm giving you time to breathe. She didn't thank him. She didn't smile. She simply turned and walked inside, leaving him alone in the hallway. That night, the headlines started. It began with a single post on a gossip blog. Mysterious woman spotted with billionaire Zaid al-Mansour. By morning, the story was everywhere. Photos of Aminata entering his SUV, grainy images of them near the desert. A video. Someone from her delivery hub must have leaked it, showing her laughing with him at the car window. The internet turned savage. She's just another gold digger. Watch her disappear after the bank transfer. This is what happens when billionaires get bored. Why her? She looks like a housemaid. Zaid's phone buzzed non-stop. Layla stormed into his office without knocking. Zaid, the board wants answers. Investors are panicking. You've been trending for hours. He didn't respond. He was already dialing Aminata. No answer. He tried again. Voicemail. Then a text came through, short and cold. You shouldn't have come to my building. They know where I live now. I quit my job. Don't contact me. His chest tightened. He had meant to protect her, but all he'd done was drag her into his world's ugliness. A world that chews people up and spits them out if they don't fit its mold. Zaid stood at the edge of his office, staring down at the glittering skyline. For years, he thought he had everything. Now, with everything in flames around him, he realized what he truly wanted was slipping away. And this time, money wouldn't fix it. He grabbed his coat. If the world wouldn't make room for her, then he would tear down the walls himself. But he had no idea what he'd find on the other side. Zaid didn't wait for permission. He left the office before security could stop him and drove straight to Aminata's building. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the dusty skyline, but he felt none of its warmth. His thoughts were racing, heart pounding, as he replayed her message over and over in his mind. Don't contact me. But he had to. He couldn't let it end like this. Not after everything they had shared. Not after the look in her eyes that night in the desert. When he reached the building, her door was locked. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder. Still nothing. A woman on the neighboring balcony looked over. She's gone, she said simply. Zaid turned. Gone where? She packed her things early this morning. Didn't say where. Just left. It hit him like a punch to the chest. She was running. Not from him, but from everything his world had done to her. He stood there for a long moment, frozen, until something caught his eye. A torn envelope sticking out of the trash bin near her door. Inside was a folded piece of paper. Against his better judgment, he pulled it out. It was a letter, handwritten. Zaid, I didn't ask for this, and I didn't want it to end this way. But I can't be the woman they expect you to love. I'm tired of fighting battles that aren't mine. They look at me like I stole something that was never meant for me. Maybe they're right. Don't look for me, please. Aminata, Zaid crumpled the paper in his fist. They were not right. She didn't steal anything. She was everything. The only person who ever saw him without a price tag. And he had let her walk away, but not any more. 3 days passed. Zaid went silent on social media. He pulled out of 2 press conferences, cancelled a trip to London, and declined all investor calls. Layla was nearly in tears from stress. Zaid, the board is threatening to remove you. You need to show up. Give them something. He stood in the center of his office, staring at the massive wall of windows behind his desk. But his mind was elsewhere. Then, almost in a whisper, he asked her, "What do you know about Dakar?" Layla blinked. "In Senegal?" "Yes." She narrowed her eyes. "You're not serious?" but he was. The next morning, Zaid's private jet touched down on a dusty runway just outside the city of Dakar. The heat hit him hard, thick and humid, but he barely noticed. He had only one address. An old contact from his foundation had given it to him, saying Aminata's mother had been transferred there recently for treatment. Zaid arrived at the small, worn-down medical clinic in a white button-up shirt, no tie, no entourage. For once, he didn't want to be seen as a billionaire. Just a man looking for the woman he should have fought for sooner. He walked through the narrow halls, nurses whispering as he passed. When he reached the room, he hesitated. Inside, an older woman lay on a hospital bed, thin and fragile, with deep eyes that mirrored Aminata's. Sitting beside her, holding a spoon of soup with trembling hands, was Aminata. She turned her head, slowly. Her eyes met his. They widened with disbelief, then pain, then something else. She stood up quickly. "Zaid, what are you doing here?" "I read your letter," he said quietly. "You weren't supposed to," she replied, her voice tight. "I know, but I did. And now I'm here." She stepped toward him, her arms folded across her chest, as if to shield her heart. "I told you not to follow me. I didn't come to drag you back into my world," he said. "I came because I want to be part of yours." Aminata shook her head. "You don't know what that means." "I do," he said. "And if it means sitting on a plastic chair in a hot room, eating soup with your mother, and helping you open that cafe you dreamed about, then that's exactly what I want." Her breath caught. His words weren't wrapped in diamonds or promises. They were real, grounded, like her. For the first time, she didn't speak. She just looked at him, and her hand slowly, almost shyly, reached for his. But then the door opened. A man in a suit stepped in, speaking French. He handed Aminata a folder. She scanned the paper quickly. "What is it?" Zaid asked. She turned to him, tears brimming in her eyes. "My mother," she whispered. "They're moving her to a private hospital. Someone paid in full, years in advance." Zaid didn't say a word. She knew it was him. And suddenly, the walls she had built to protect herself began to fall. The hospital room grew quiet. Aminata sat beside her mother again, her hand still holding Zaid's. The nurses passed by, whispering in surprise at the man sitting in a plastic chair beside a woman no one had ever noticed before. Zaid didn't care. He wasn't looking at his phone, or at the time. He was watching Aminata feed her mother gently, with a patience and love he'd never seen in any of the people who surrounded him back home. That night, they walked together down a sandy road near the hospital. Neither said much. Their hands touched briefly, then held on. Aminata finally turned to him. "What happens now?" she asked. Zaid looked at her, the stars reflected in his eyes. "Whatever you want," he said. I'm not going to force you into my world, but I'd give up all of it just to be in yours." She didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, she said, "I'm not afraid of your world. I'm afraid it will crush what we have." He stopped. "Then we build something they can't crush." And for the first time since she met him, she believed it. Back in Abu Dhabi, the scandal hadn't died. Board members were threatening to remove Zaid from his position. His company's stock had dropped 5%. Rumors flew that he'd gone mad, that a woman had ruined him, that he was walking away from the empire he built. In a board meeting, one of the older partners shouted across the table, "You are choosing a delivery girl over the entire Al Mansour legacy." Zaid stood calmly and looked every one of them in the eye. "No, I'm choosing someone who reminds me why I built it in the first place." He walked out before they could respond. That night, he announced his resignation. The press exploded. And in the middle of it all, Aminata called him. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered. "It's not just a statement anymore. You're really leaving everything?" He smiled into the phone. "I didn't lose everything. I found you." 1 year later, the little cafe in Dakar opened its doors. It wasn't huge. It didn't have marble counters or golden chandeliers, but it had books, warm food, and music that played softly from a speaker near the window. On opening day, Aminata's mother sat in her wheelchair by the door, smiling as the first customers walked in. Zaid served the tea himself. The press had long moved on, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't being chased by cameras or bodyguards. He was just Zaid, a man in love. People came not because of who he was, but because of how the cafe made them feel. Warm, seen, free. Later that night, after the lights dimmed and the doors were locked, Aminata sat beside him at one of the tables. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The towers, the meetings, the empire." Zaid turned to her, kissed her hand, and said, "I was never a king. I was a prisoner. This is the first place I've ever felt free." Months passed. The cafe became known as a safe haven for women, students, and dreamers. One evening, a young delivery girl came in wearing the same green jacket Aminata used to wear. She looked tired, hungry, and nervous. Aminata smiled, walked over, and handed her a plate. On the house, the girl's eyes filled with tears. Zaid watched from the counter, his chest full. Life had come full circle. He walked to the window, looked out at the city lights, and whispered, "They said I was crazy to give it all up for a delivery girl." Aminata came up behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist, and rested her head on his back. "You didn't give it all up," she whispered. "You just chose something better." And in that small cafe on the edge of a forgotten street, love lived quietly, far from the noise. but stronger than anything money could ever buy. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Share it with someone who still believes in love beyond status, and help us spread stories of courage, choice, and compassion.